Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us. We're here today with Dr. Guy Leschziner, who works as a consultant neurologist within the Department of Neurology and Sleep Disorders Center at Guy's and St. Thomas's Hospitals, and at London Bridge Hospital, the Cromwell Hospital, and One Welbeck. He was clinical lead for the Sleep Disorders Center, Guy's Hospital, one of Europe's largest sleep units, for over a decade. He is also a professor of neurology and sleep medicine at the Institute of Psychiatry, Psychology, and Neuroscience, King's College in London. Dr. Leschziner is author of a new book titled Seven Deadly Sins, The Biology of Being Human. He's also the author of The Nocturnal Brain, Nightmares, Neuroscience, and the Secret World of Sleep, now translated into 14 languages, and also The Man Who Tasted Words. He has presented 3 series on BBC Radio 4 and BBC World Service, and is recipient of the 2019 Ellison Cliff Medal from the Royal Society of Medicine. You can learn more at his website. I'm going to spell this so that everyone can make sure that they get it correctly. GUYLESCHZINER.com. So many congratulations on all of your amazing work, and thank you so much for joining us.
Not at all. My pleasure, Brian. Thank you for having me.
So beyond what I mentioned, is there anything else that you'd like to share with folks about you?
I think that's more than enough about me.
Well, you live in London, right?
I do, yeah.
And you have family there?
I do. I have a wife and two daughters who are growing up fast.
Wonderful, wonderful. Well, in some sense, I'm jealous because I love London. So, I'm glad that you've been there for quite some time.
Well, I will swap you for New Jersey.
You might get a little bit bored. I'm kind of in the country a little bit, so it's not like being in the big city. First, a disclaimer. I have no medical background whatsoever, and so I'm likely to say things in ways that are relatively crude and uninformed. So I'll apologize in advance for that. But hopefully, our listeners who similarly share a lack of background will be able to gain some insight from this conversation. Um, I'd love, before we get into your books, can you talk to us more, a little more about your medical work, because it's quite fascinating.
Yeah, so I'm very fortunate in my career because I trained as a neurologist, but I also specialized in a couple of areas that include epilepsy and perhaps more unusually, sleep medicine. And so alongside my specialist work where I see referrals from other neurologists for those specialties, I also see general neurological patients day in, day out, which has given me quite a breadth of experience in terms of seeing a range of conditions that ultimately reflect the fact that this fascinating lump of tissue, the 1 or 2 pounds of jelly, influences, how we experience the world, how we move through it, how we behave, and of course, how we sleep as well.
Yeah, I mean, I could ask you later about some advice in terms of sleeping, but I'm sure you've seen it all, which is quite valuable. Um, I mentioned the 2 previous books that also have very fascinating titles, just like the new one that we're going to talk about. Would you share a little bit about those 2 titles with us?
Sure. I mean, a common theme through the work that I do in terms of writing is very much surrounding taking my patients with neurological problems, those neurological problems affecting their sleep or how they experience the world or how they behave, trying to understand those patients, both in a neurological context, but also in a human context, and seeing how what we learn from looking at those extremes of the human experience applies to us all, which of course it does. It gives us very important insights into how all of us behave, how all of us sleep, how all of us experience the world. And
Yes.
so the first book was very much the Nocturnal Brain was about individuals who I've seen with uh, sometimes weird, sometimes wonderful, sometimes terrible conditions affecting their sleep, and reflecting back on what that tells us about how we all sleep and the importance of sleep for us. The second book, The Man Who Tasted Words, looked at individuals in whom their perception of the world was influenced by their medical condition and what the implications are for us all. And this current book, Seven Deadly Sins, takes very much the same template of looking at individuals with neurological problems or psychiatric problems in some cases, and what those tell us about how the brain regulates our behavior.
Yes, yes. I found it very interesting. Again, I don't have a background in this area, so this is all new to me. But boy, I mean, just hear some of the stories and the situations that you described was just amazing. So, as I mentioned, the title of the book, Seven Deadly Sins, the biology of being human. How did this specific book come about?
Well, on a regular basis, I see individuals in my clinic in whom their behavior has been fundamentally altered by their neurological condition, be that seizures generating anger or violence, individuals in whom drugs that are sometimes prescribed influencing their eating behavior or their sexual behavior. And it was very much a case of trying to reframe the behavior of my patients away from a sort of moralistic perspective and towards a more biological one. Now, obviously, Seven Deadly Sins is a concept that all of us who live in a sort of Western Judeo-Christian culture are familiar with, and actually provided a very good framework for trying to take those negative behaviors to try and understand them and understand the implications for us all.
Yes, yes, it's a good framework for discussing, what are some very deep problems and ones that science has not completely explained yet, obviously. So,
Yeah.
lot of interesting fertile ground for discovery and discussion. No doubt.
And
Um,
I guess it's important to say that, the scientific understanding of some of these behaviors is highly variable. So for the behaviors that really have a massive impact on our societies, things like aggression or violence, or gluttony, um, the understanding of how our brain regulates these functions, these behaviors, is far greater than, for example, sins like greed, because greed, to some extent, is very part and parcel of our society and is to a large extent normalized.
mhm, mhm. You talk a lot about in the book about the whole concept of regulation, you know, as distinct from the source itself, which I think is a very valuable distinction as well.
Yeah, we know that there are parts of the brain that are responsible for generating certain behaviors, but we also know that there are other parts of the brain that are responsible for reining them in. And so there is this constant balance, this constant equipoise within our brains. Whilst there is this part of the brain that drives these behaviors, and of course, there are questions as to why we all exhibit these behaviors. And then there are parts of the brain that really act as a brake.
Hmm, hmm. So you trace several specific human actions back to the areas of the brain most responsible for those actions. So can you share an example of that for folks?
Yeah, you highlight something important, that you say most responsible rather than primarily responsible, because our view of how the brain works has moved a little away from there being an anger center or a love center, or specific nubs of tissue that are solely responsible for particular functions. And we now understand that the brain works more as a network. Having said all of that, it's very clear, especially given some of the individuals that I describe in the book, that there are areas of the brain that are fundamentally important in some of these functions. So, for example, there is a tiny nub of tissue deep in the center of our brains, which is called the hypothalamus. And the hypothalamus is responsible for many of those very basic behaviors that sustain life. Things like eating, like drinking, like sex, for example. Whereas there are other parts of the brain, in particular the frontal lobes, the prefrontal cortex, which is the bit of the brain that sits right here at the front and is really the discriminator between us and other species. In fact, I refer to it as the seat of humanity because it's the bit of the brain that is responsible for rational thinking, for planning, for reining in antisocial behaviors. And so we see that individuals, for example, who have abnormalities in the prefrontal cortex often have difficulties reining in emotions, reining in antisocial behaviors. The most famous of these is a chap called Phineas Gage, who dates back to the 1840s, who was a chap working on the railroads in Vermont, and unfortunately had an industrial accident whilst doing so. And he was using a tamping iron to push dynamite into a hole and unfortunately ignited the dynamite and the tamping iron passed through the frontal lobes. Remarkably, he survived this in 1848 in the days before antibiotics, but afterwards was a completely changed man who, previously was God-fearing, was abstinent of alcohol and was very polite and kind. And in the aftermath of this accident, began swearing, going to whorehouses, and becoming very aggressive and was a deeply unpleasant character by the accounts of the time. And so this really gives us a very good example of well, the role of this area of the brain in terms of reining in our more basic behaviors. But of course, some of the individuals that I describe in the book are more modern examples of that.
Yes, and I think, some of those very specific cases, are, I'm sure, very valuable in your, regard because they allow something to be isolated, brain-wise that otherwise isn't the case. And so the kind of analysis around that, is seems to be pretty unique and powerful in terms of what it can tell the rest of us.
Yeah, these are unique experiments of nature from which we can derive an awful lot of knowledge. Now, one might say, well, how does Phineas Gage and his tamping iron really influence how we all behave? But actually, modern medicine tells us that these parts of the brain, that subtle differences in these parts of the brain also affect all of us, those who haven't had massive brain injury or degenerative disease of the brain.
What would you share in terms of, a more modern example of, like one of your particular um, patients and how their situation was enlightening?
Yeah, so for example, I detail one individual in the book who was started on a particular medication to control his epilepsy, and that medication resulted in him having really extreme outbreaks of rage, resulting in putting himself and his family at peril. So you can then, when you get cases like that, then you begin to understand what the impact of brain chemistry is on our behaviors. There are individuals who I describe in the book, one, for example, who is a young woman who has a genetic condition that influences how that little nub of tissue called the hypothalamus functions. And she has completely uncontrollable hunger, never to be sated, who eats without end, essentially. And that
Mm,
gives us some really important insights into the role of the hypothalamus in feeding behavior for us all.
mm. Um, so, in a book that's kind of formed around, the seven deadly sins, you can't avoid some degree of controversy. So let me
Yeah.
read a couple of the things that you wrote that I pulled out. Um, First one is, without anger, we would be unmotivated to strive. Another one is, without lust, we are destined to no life at all. And the third one, sloth, is usually a healthy trait, a balancing of weighing scales of energy and reward. So I'm not sure I agree with all of those. I kind of see some of these a little bit differently. Any of those that you'd like to comment on?
Yeah, I can comment on all of those. Look, essentially, you have to wonder why these sins, and I use the term sins in inverted commas, are so ubiquitous amongst all mankind. The fact that every single religion is fascinated by why humans do the things that they do illustrates the fact that this happens in every society and every culture. And so one has to wonder why these traits exist throughout humankind. And the fact is that these sins, when they are regulated, when they are mild, or when they're appropriate to a particular situation or a setting, actually have a distinct evolutionary advantage. They aid survival. And that's why they have spread throughout humankind. So if you want to take anger, for example, so anger is an emotion that is the response to having a thwarted goal or in defense of resources. And one can very readily understand why anger may have a useful purpose. Now, to distinguish anger from violence, of course, but actually, if you go to a psychology laboratory and you give individuals a puzzle to solve, a puzzle that is insolvable, and you look at how much anger is generated by that puzzle, those individuals who generate more anger in response to that puzzle will often persist at a second puzzle longer and are more likely to solve that second puzzle. Similarly, envy, for example, look, envy is a response to searching out resources that are in demand by the rest of society. And so actually, when resources are limited and when you have to compete for those resources, then a little bit of envy would not necessarily be a bad thing. I forget the other example that you
Sloth,
talked about.
sloth, and
Sloth.
lust
Okay.
were two other ones.
Okay.
Yeah.
So sloth, look, if we had no sloth whatsoever, then we would be incredibly active, burning energy for no good reason on a constant basis, which is clearly not a good thing for our survival. So a little bit of sloth in terms of balancing the decision as to whether or not to expend energy in the pursuit of some goal is really important. A particular example of sloth that I give is the sloth that people experience when they have an infection, when they have flu, for example. Our brain has specific areas in response to infection that actually generate slothful behaviors because that allows us to divert energy from running around like headless chickens, which we do in our day-to-day lives, and actually divert those resources to fighting infection, to healing, to recuperation. So, I stand by those statements very much. Now, where it might be controversial is obviously if those natural human traits are inappropriate to the setting or are intense to the extreme, and they create issues for the individual or create issues for the people around them, then that is problematic.
Sure, sure. Well, I guess, kind of my disagreement has a couple different levels. One is maybe just definitional. So like you say sloth is usually a healthy trait, a balancing of the weighing of scales of energy and reward. For me, things like sloth or anger are examples of an imbalance. In other words, yeah, I completely acknowledge, for instance, the needs, the tension, they're there. But to me, those terms imply imbalance.
So,
So,
so, so, so what, just to use the term righteous anger, you know,
mhm.
anger is what has driven, aspects of society to improve in some respects. So
But see,
these are
there I
not,
see a big difference between motivation and anger.
yeah, but
To
anger
me,
can
those are two
drive,
different things, right?
but
Anger is under control.
anger can drive motivation. And so I guess the question is when anger is at an extreme whereby it generates things like inappropriate violence or inappropriate social behavior, then it's a problem.
Mhm,
We all
mhm.
experience anger in our day-to-day lives. And some people use the anger for good, and some people, use the anger for bad.
And in my own personal experience, I view anger as unhelpful because if I am confronting a situation, I get angry about it, I'm less likely to handle it well than if I'm much more. um, rational and impassioned about it. But that's
Yeah,
a personal
yeah.
thing too. So I mean,
So I would make the distinction between the emotion and rationality. And you can channel the emotion in a rational way. And if you think about, the anger that has driven forward our society in terms of some of the social issues that it encounters, if you think about, you know, angry journalists campaigning for change, or angry politicians who are campaigning for change. There are many, many social issues in humanity that have been improved by properly channeled anger.
fair enough. Fair enough. The other question this kind of raises for me is evolutionary in nature, in that I have this feeling, this sense that some of these traits were more valuable in the past and less so now. And that we just haven't evolved fast enough as humans to get rid of some of this stuff or mitigate some of this stuff that is now more problematic than maybe what it was centuries ago.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's absolutely correct. If we look at, hunger and gluttony, for example, those evolutionary mechanisms to drive our hunger evolved in an environment where we were hunter-gatherers, or, because the vast majority of the evolutionary time that humankind has had has been in those circumstances. And we see the effects now of living in a very calorie-rich world where food is at the click of a button on your mobile phone. We did not evolve to live in such circumstances. The same with the lust as well. Our societies have changed. The biggest issue is the fact that we now have, contraception, and that lust is less about driving the generation of future descendants. Um, you know, these are unusual times in our evolutionary presence on Earth.
Well, just wait until artificial intelligence, has more of an impact, and our inability to be able to cope with that, I think, is going to be a serious issue. But that's
Indeed.
another discussion. But um, in your discussion of pride, I really like the distinction that you made between authentic pride and hubristic pride. Can you explain those for our audience?
Yeah. So there are aspects of pride that really border on self-esteem that I think are very, very helpful. We have pride in our communities, we have pride in our jobs, we have pride in our families, that have a beneficial effect. And again, as with the examples that I gave with regard to anger and how people perform in a psychology lab, if you induce pride in individuals, they will often perform better at the task that is given to them. And so that's authentic pride. But hubristic pride is the pride that really is character, and the meaning of pride has changed very much in the modern age. If you
Yeah.
if you look
Mhm.
at social media, you'll see social media riddled with I'm proud of X, I'm proud of Y, I'm proud to have been listed for this prize or whatever. And so pride has taken on a slightly different meaning in today's society. I guess the hubristic pride that we talk about is the pride of old, the pride of the Bible, whereby, an overinflation, a sort of narcissism of oneself, an inability to take criticism, an inflated of an inflated sense of self-importance comes to the fore. And that creates major problems. One could argue that hubristic pride is responsible for many of the terrible political decisions that have been taken over the last 100 years or so. And
Sure.
so there is this sort of very clear distinction between the pride that generates good and the pride that generates bad.
Hmm. Hmm. Um, Again, I think it's important to bring out those distinctions and discuss them because in our society, a lot gets just kind of like, swept over and not handled in a thoughtful way when we use words like pride as an example.
Yeah, yeah.
In the end, you raise a very fundamental question. Is there such a thing as free will? or are all of our actions deterministic based on our genes and our environments? And I have to say that I love your conclusion to that question, which is, as you state, it is likely that, as with all aspects of humanity, there's a spectrum when it comes to the underlying explanation for our behaviors. I'll have to say that in my own lifetime, I've evolved more and more toward believing that. When I was young, the world was very black and white, and now I understand everything is basically gray.
Yeah.
So, would you like to comment though on your discussion there?
Yeah, so what's quite clear in my clinical practice is that there are individuals in whom it's really difficult to argue that they have free will. In the context of a devastating brain injury or illness, they are clearly not the people that they were beforehand. The ability to restrict the behaviors that we see as sinful have been really largely taken out of our hands. When we look at the factors that influence the behavior of normal individuals, and the question of what is normal is an entirely different can of worms. What we see is that there are factors for all of us that are potentially beyond our control, that include our genes, that include our environment, that include how we are brought up, what chemicals that we are exposed to, that influence, they don't necessarily define, but they influence our behaviors. And so my view is that there are people that sit at every part of that spectrum in terms of free will. There are those individuals who I firmly believe, that, like the patients in my clinic that I discuss, who really don't seem to have any free will whatsoever. Their condition defines their behavior entirely. There are individuals who have some moderate influences that influence their decision making, that influence their behaviors to some extent. And then there are individuals at the other extreme of the spectrum whose genetics, whose environment, whose exposure to all of this have really had no bearing on the way that their brain has
Hmm.
developed, on the way that their brain has grown. And I suspect that those individuals do have free will. Now, there's a question of how you define free will as well, because I strongly believe that, and this is again controversial, but I strongly believe that the decisions that we make are entirely a function of our brains, how our brains are wired, how our brains function. And so one can argue on that basis that none of us have free will, that any decision that we make is an obligate decision and that free will is an illusion. Now that's, I accept it is very, very controversial. And, as I hope people reading the book will recognize, the honest answer is, I'm still not sure.
Well, I don't know how else to approach, honestly, personally, with my admitted lack of background in this area, that just seems it's an intractable question.
And I single-handedly am not going to be the one to answer it. But this is why this question has taxed neuroscientists, philosophers for generations, and will continue to tax them for generations more.
Absolutely, absolutely. So, what would you like readers to most take away from this amazing book?
I think it's an understanding that because somebody behaves in the way that they do, it is worth spending a little bit of time trying to understand why it is that they behave in the way that they do. This book, in the writing of it, has also made me examine myself and try to understand my own behaviors and the factors have led to my own behaviors. Now, it, I conclude very strongly that this is not an argument for saying, well, none of us have any fault. None of us have any moral responsibility. We should open the jail doors and let everybody out. That's exactly what I'm not saying. But it's about understanding, understanding ourselves and understanding others.
Amen. Amen. So, I know you've, just recently published this, but are there any future plans that you can talk about, whether it's in terms of books or other projects?
Yeah, I'm thinking about something. So, obviously, I'm uh, about to hit 50, and as everybody who goes through these milestones experiences, I'm a little bit more fixated on what is happening to my brain as I get older. So, I'm thinking about something along those lines.
Good, good. Well, don't wait too long, so it'll help me out before I get too much load. So, thanks so much for joining us, and thanks so much for all the work that it took to create this book. That alone is a massive exercise, and I appreciate the difficulty and the work that you went through to do it.
Well, thank you very much for reading it, importantly.
So again, the title of the book is Seven Deadly Sins: The Biology of Being Human, and check out the doctor's website and learn more. Thanks again.
Bye, Brian.